The story of Halo has become huge over time. What started in Combat Evolved as a standalone game has evolved into a massive expanded universe that goes beyond the games in the forms of books, comics, and even some live action web series. However, as the Halo universe expands, it means more and more of the stories being found outside of the games, which has been a complaint from Halo fans when regarding 343's stewardship of the franchise. That said, I bet you couldn't tell me how Master Chief and Johnson got back to Earth without reading First Strike or watching a video on it. So today I'm going to examine every Halo game minus Spartan Assault and Strike to see if you really need to read the books and consume other expanded universe material to understand the main story in the games. I have a feeling it is less of a yes or no answer and more about how interested you are in the finer details and how much you really want to know about all the different elements that make up a Halo story. So, starting with Combat Evolved, the first Halo game, which released November 15th, 2001. You would think that this is the first piece of Halo media to ever release to the world, but just over 2 weeks earlier on the 30th of October of the same year, Halo The Fall of Reach would release. The book explains the origins of Master Chief and the other Spartan 2s and introduces us to important characters, some seen in the games like Cortana and Captain Keyes, and others that wouldn't be seen in the games for years, such as Dr. Halsey. However, Halo Combat Evolved does not really require you to read the books to understand the story of the game, as much of what happens in Combat Evolved has little to do with the Fall of Reach itself, aside from a few lines in the opening cutscene implying there had been a larger war between the UNSC and the Covenant. Halo CE is a successful, self-contained story. Fans that do read the Fall of Reach will have a greater understanding of the Master Chief's upbringing as a Spartan and the Spartan program in general, as well as the insurrection and the war against the Covenant. Additionally, there is The Flood, which is basically a novelization of Halo CE, but it includes the perspectives from other characters not seen in the games, such as Melissa McKay, Antonio Silva, and Zuka Zamami, the latter of which we have just made a video on. Arriving at Halo 2, things are a little bit different. As I said at the start, at the beginning of Halo 2, fans are given no clue as to how the Chief and Johnson escaped the events of Alpha Halo. The details of how that happened is explained in the book Halo First Strike, which released on the 2nd of December 2003, almost a full year before Halo 2 released. In First Strike, the story picks up where Halo C and Halo The Flood left off, with Master Chief and Cortana flying in the longsword they were in at the end of the game. They discover a nearby cryotube containing Spartan Linda 058, as well as a Pelican containing 4 survivors, those being only Lieutenant Elias Havison, Warrant Officer Sheila Pulaski, Marine Corporal Locklear, and Sergeant Avery Johnson. The group capture a Covenant ship, they reunite with Blue Team, and they destroy a lot of Covenant ships. I have more details about this in my video called The Survivors of the Halo Trilogy. However, in regards to the question, do you need to read First Strike or any other prior Halo book to understand Halo 2? You definitely do not. Halo 2 sets the scene for the game with a fantastic intro. It recaps the events of the first game, introduces us to the unseen Covenant commander from Halo CE, that being Fel Vadami, who later becomes the Arbiter, as well as showing us what Covenant society looks like, as it's cut between clips of the UNSC above Earth right before they go into battle with the Covenant. The rest of the story, like CE, is self-contained, and the only other Halo expanded universe you need to know is the events of the first game. Playing through Halo 2, we are easily introduced to new characters, understand who they are and what their roles are. The Arbiter is the Covenant's in-game equivalent to the Chief. Lord Hood is the commander of the UNSC, the Prophets are the leaders of the Covenant, Miranda Keyes is the legacy of Jacob Keyes from the first game, Ratus Vidam is one of the few beings the Arbiter can trust and rely on, Tartarus is the leader of the Brutes and a type of enforcer character for the Prophet, and the Gravemind is the central intelligence of the Flood. Of course, Halo 2 does have its cliffhanger ending, where a mission aboard the Foreigner Key ship was supposed to take place, but was cut due to problems in game development. This was later visualized in a Halo comic, but it's not overly significant to the story so far, or with what's to come. Halo 3 essentially picks up where Halo 2 ends, that being the Key ship approaching Earth's orbit. Basically all of the characters from Halo 2 return, minus the dead ones, obviously, and by the end of Halo 3 only a few of the returning characters survive, with Miranda, Johnson, Truth, 343 Guilty Spark and the Gravemind all being killed or destroyed. In the same year that Halo 3 released, the Halo book Ghosts of Onyx, which serves as a follow-up to First Strike, as well as the introduction for the Spartan 3 program, was also released. However, its story is largely separate from that of Halo 2 and Halo 3, minus the fact we get to see Blue Team battling on Earth, as well as some of the effects that the destruction of Alpha Halo had on other foreign facilities, namely the Shield World Onyx. But do you need to know any of that to understand what happens in Halo 3? Well, you do not. Halo 3 for the most part seamlessly continues the story from Halo 2, right up to its closing sequence with the Master Chief being stranded in space. With the first 3 games out of the way, it's time to talk about Halo's first spin-off, Halo Wars. Set in 2531, just over 20 years before Halo CE, Halo Wars was the first game to really expand upon the universe of Halo, with a combination of epic cutscenes by Blur and RTS style gameplay that featured many new ideas in the form of new vehicles, infantry for both the UNSC and the Covenant. Now, it was often stated in some old Halo media that Master Chief was the last Spartan, and while that was never officially the case, you would be forgiven for believing it to be, but Halo Wars, while being set way before CE, confirms the existence of other Spartans on screen for the first time in the form of Red Team. This trio of Spartans would finally show players what a Spartan is actually like in the lore, in no small part thanks to this epic cutscene. But what about the books? Could you have read any Halo books to increase your understanding of the story in Halo Wars? And importantly, do you need to? Well, not really. However, that said, the limited edition of Halo Wars did come with a Halo comic/graphic novel that visualizes one of the first engagements with the Covenant, demonstrating their technological superiority. It also introduces us to Professor Anders, where she's essentially acquired by Oni, but still, it's not required reading to understand the game. There is also the book Contact Harvest, which does detail the very first encounter between humanity and the Covenant, but aside from a majority of the book taking place on Harvest, it has little to do with Halo Wars, and so fans should be able to enjoy Halo Wars without having to worry about consuming other Halo media. ODST was for a while meant to be an expansion for Halo 3, dubbed Halo 3 Recon, but was later changed to a full-price game that we know today as Halo 3 ODST. Again, like all of the Halo games so far, you don't need to read any of the existing books to understand the story of this game. It is a complete standalone adventure, however returning players from Halo 2 especially will have a better understanding of what's going on, especially during the opening sequence where we see the Prophet of Regret flee Earth in his assault carrier. Throughout the game you see some graffiti decals saying Remember Reach, but otherwise there is few nods to the expanded universe outside of the existing games. I should also note that by the time ODST released, fans knew that Halo Reach would be releasing later down the line, as a trailer for Reach already existed, and an invitation to the Halo Reach beta was included with ODST. There isn't much more to say, so let's move on to Bungie's final Halo game, Reach. As Bungie's final entry to the series, they opted for a prequel to the first game, which was often touted as the beginning to a story that had already had its end, which is interesting because technically Halo Wars predates Halo Reach in the timeline, and so would technically be more of a beginning in that sense. Regardless, Halo Reach introduces many new ideas to players who, if haven't read at least a few of the books, are going to be somewhat stumped. And while not explicitly mentioned in the game, you in fact play as a Spartan 3, but what is a Spartan 3 and what makes them different to a Spartan 2? These questions are not answered in the game, and if a player wanted to find out, they would have to read Halo Ghosts of Onyx. Ghosts of Onyx, as we mentioned earlier, is largely the story of the Spartan 3 program. Unlike Spartan 2s, the 3s were meant to be cheaper to train and equip, produced in far greater numbers, be selected from volunteer orphans rather than adopted children, and sent on suicidal missions, which in most cases resulted in almost 100% casualty rates. And finally, the Spartan 3s would don SPI armor, that is semi-powered infiltration armor, which is far weaker and less protective than Mjolnir armor worn by the Spartan 2s, but is greater for concealment, as it has the function of reflecting nearby surfaces and light, creating a mirage effect for anyone looking. However, the Spartans of Noble Team, consisting of 5 Spartan 3s and 1 Spartan 2s, all wear Mjolnir power armor. This is because the members of Noble Team was pulled out of their respective Spartan companies for specific and specialist assignments. That's just the Spartans though, so what about the rest of the game? Well, as mentioned earlier, there is the book Halo: The Fall of Reach, which details the Master Chief's upbringing in the Spartan 2 program, their early days and missions, as well as, you guessed it, the Fall of Reach itself. That said, there are some inconsistencies between the book and the game, with the Covenant appearing on Reach in the game over a month earlier than they appear in the book, and this would remain an inconsistency until a later reprint of the Fallout Reach that has some patchwork to blend the two mediums together, but it is patchwork at best. That said, do you need to read either Ghost of Onyx or the Fall of Reach to get a better understanding for what happens in the game? Well, not entirely, but I wouldn't give it a definitive no, unlike the other games that we've looked at so far. Reading The Fall of Reach will give you a better understanding of the space battles above Reach, as well as the efforts of Captain Jacob Keyes, who does appear in the game as well as the accomplishments of Dr. Halsey, who also makes her first in-game appearance. Fans who also read Ghost of Onyx will have a greater understanding of the different Spartan generations, though the Spartan Threes in Reach are not quite how they are depicted in Ghost of Onyx. So, with that said, let's move on to 343's first Halo game, Halo 4. As many of us who were around for it at the time know, Halo 4 was a divisive game. Primarily in the multiplayer portion of the game, the campaign was received better, but one of the biggest complaints from some fans was that it leaned too heavily on the lore established outside of the games. But how true is this claim? Well, I think it depends on how much you want to understand the different aspects of Halo 4. Now, despite writing various lore videos, I have not actually read the Forerunner trilogy, but I do know in that trilogy, the Didact that we meet in Halo 4, as well as the Librarian, are featured in great detail. It would also be their first appearance in the Halo lore outside of the Halo 3 terminals. Now, if you really want to know the ins and outs of who the Librarian and the Didact are, then you would have to read the Forerunner trilogy. But if you just play through the games, it still shouldn't be that complicated to get the gist of who these characters are, as well as their motivations. The Librarian explains that there was once a war between humanity and the Forerunners, but was actually the result of what could essentially be a huge misunderstanding, as the humans fired on Forerunner worlds when they detected the Flood presence. Some of this is explained by the Librarian in a cutscene, as well as some of the terminals found throughout Halo 4. Moving on, we have the Covenant of Halo 4, which have a more significant role in Halo 4 Spartan Ops. Now, this is one area that I would have to agree with fans that this Covenant faction has much of its backstory rooted in the books, in particular their leader, Jul Mdama. Jul Mdama, like many Sangheili, was angered by the Prophets and their betrayal of the elites, but Jul did not find himself in agreement with the Arbiter, and so joined the Servants of the Abiding Truth, led by the Sangheili, Avumed Talcam. Talcam initiated a war between his own forces and the Arbiters. However, one day, Jul followed Talcam to see where he was getting his weapons, and to his surprise and disgust, Talcam was being supplied by the humans. Although while spying on the meeting he was knocked out by Spartan Naomi 010 and taken into custody on Onyx, he would later escape through a portal to the Sangheili world of Hasduros, where its population of Sangheili was still devout to the Forerunners, and here, Jul Mdama would recruit his Covenant that we see in Halo 4. Now, none of these details are mentioned, not once in Halo 4's campaign or Spartan Ops. And I do plan to make a more detailed video on the topic, so look out for that one. So do you need to either read the Kilo 5 trilogy of books or the Forerunner trilogy of books to understand Halo 4? Well, a bit like Halo Reach, it's not a straight answer. Fans who have read the Forerunner trilogy, Glasslands and the Thursday War will certainly have a better understanding of certain aspects like the Forerunners we meet and Jul Mdama. But I still don't consider this required reading to understand the main campaign at least. Which brings us to Halo 5. Halo 5 features mine and many others' least favourite Halo campaign. The game only featured Master Chief for 3 missions, the game was incredibly short and was designed around 4-player co-op, so at all times there were 3 additional Spartans with you, and where the writing was concerned, a lot of the time it felt like they had nothing to do other than spout exposition. The writers and designers for Halo 5 didn't understand something that is show and don't tell. Much of the dialogue in Halo 5 is mainly members of Fireteam Osiris, explaining things, but it's hard at times to follow where none of it is being shown. Additionally, the data pads found throughout the games, a lot of them don't actually have anything to do with what's going on in the game itself. However, we're not here to critique the game, we're here to find out if you need to read books to understand it. And the answer is more on the yes side than any prior entry so far. Getting straight into it, with Fireteam Osiris, we are introduced to 3 new characters, as well as Buck, who returns from Halo 3 ODST. Except from Buck, these are all newcomers to the game. However, they have all appeared in other forms of Halo media. Starting with Locke, who appears in the awful web series Halo Nightfall, a live-action piece about Agent Locke and his journey to Alpha Shard concerning a new bioweapon that is especially deadly to humans. Next up is Olympia Vale, an expert in everything Sangheili and knowledgeable in foreigner sites. She makes her first appearance in the Halo book Hunters in the Dark, where a group of humans and Sangheili travel to the Ark after it's discovered on Zeta Halo that the rings have been activated, not from Zeta Halo but from the Ark on a countdown. Olympia Vale accompanies the group to the Ark, where she's somewhat of a mediator between the UNSC and the Sangheili due to her ability to speak Sangheili language. Afterwards, she is invited to join the Spartan program. Next is Holly Tanaka, who was first introduced in the comic Halo Escalation issue 17. She later returns for several more issues. In short, Holly Tanaka was part of the UNSC response to the Covenant remnant glassing the planet Clio. Thanks to her expertise, she is able to locate the survivors, with the mission being a success. She is later invited to become a Spartan. Then we have Buck, where during the Halo book New Blood, himself along with a few other members of Alpha 9 become Spartans. The game makes no effort to explain this, so you would have to read the book to understand. Then there is of course Blue Team, made up of Spartans Frederick 104, Linda 058 and Kelly 087. This is their first debut in a Halo game, despite making numerous appearances in the expanded universe. But with how little they and the Chief appear in the game, a lot of fans will be scratching their heads as to who these Spartans are. But it doesn't end there. Cortana is vastly different in this game, becoming the dictator of all known space in the Halo universe, and while in the game it's explained she survived thanks to the domain, it's again left to some exposition dialogue. In the Halo anthology comic, Halo Tales from Slipspace, there is a story called Dominion Splinter, and it follows Cortana right after Halo 4 as she finds herself at what can be described as the gates of the domain. Here she is blocked by the Warden Eternal, but she is able to stall the Warden and bypass him and take control of him and the domain through her fragments. With all the vast Forerunner information stored in the domain, she is able to heal herself, though some of her corrupted state from rampancy bleeds through, leading to a changed Cortana. We could probably keep talking about Halo 5, but I think the answer for Halo 5 is pretty obvious. Not only does the game not make much sense anyway, largely due to some poor writing and design decisions, but it is also heavily dependent on the expanded universe, not just the books, but also the comics and a web series. So, with Halo 5 out of the way, let's move on to another spin-off, Halo Wars 2. With no explanation, Halo Wars 2 begins with the Spirit of Fire somehow transported to the Ark, and so far it's not been revealed how the ship was moved from unknown space to outside the galaxy orbiting the Ark. Such a journey would take a very long time, possibly years, and that's with a slipspace drive, and if you remember at the end of Halo Wars 1, that drive was sacrificed to destroy the Shield World and its Forerunner fleet. However, unlike Halo 5, Halo Wars 2 is mostly a self-contained story that can be enjoyed without having to read any of the books. Thankfully, the game features an extensive in-game codex detailing a lot of the details and backstory of characters, units, vehicles, locations, and more. However, there is a small detail that might go over players' heads, and that is the existing presence of UNSC structures and outposts on the Ark prior to the Spirit of Fire's arrival. At the end of the first mission, Red Team are ambushed by Atriox, the leader of the Banished, inside the Henry Lamb Research Center. We mentioned earlier for Halo 5 that Hunters in the Dark introduces us to Olympia Vale. In that book, it also introduces us to Henry Lamb, a scientist of whom the research center is named after. Following the events of Hunters in the Dark, the UNSC arrive at the Ark primarily for a scientific mission, hence the presence of some UNSC buildings and outposts. But honestly, there is not much more to say about Halo Wars 2 other than that it felt very refreshing to have a good and easy to follow story in Halo after the abysmal Halo 5. So finally, we arrive at Halo Infinite. I will preface by saying from here on out there will be spoilers for Halo Infinite, at least for the opening of the game, so if you haven't started the game yet, look away now. I'm pleased to say that, other than a few things here and there, Halo Infinite is self-contained and is not dependent on the expanded universe to tell its story. It's a sequel to Halo Wars 2 as much as it is to Halo 5, with the Banished being the main enemy faction. Now, if you have played Halo Infinite, you'll know that Atriox makes his return in a stunning display, defeating the Master Chief in single combat. But how did Atriox return from the Ark after his only slipspace capable ship was destroyed? This is really one of the few areas of the game that has its answers in the book Shadows of Reach. In this book, the Banished and Keepers of the One Freedom, led by Castor, are looking for a portal on Reach that will allow Atriox to travel from the Ark to Reach, and therefore allowing him to resume command of the Banished forces in the Milky Way galaxy. After much difficulty, Castor was successful with Atriox returning to the galaxy. But otherwise, provided you have played Halo 5 and Halo Wars 2, you should be well equipped to understand the story of Halo Infinite. Even the audio logs scattered around the world are mostly to do with the events of the game or the ones leading up to it. And so I just want to finish by saying that just because Atriox is no longer on the Ark, doesn't mean the Banished are not there. So, let's sum it up. Halo C, Halo 2, Halo 3, ODST, Halo Wars 1 and 2 and Halo Infinite. You generally speaking do not need to read the books to understand what is happening. However, Halo Reach and Halo 4 could be better understood by reading some of the expanded universe, but nothing is required reading. However, Halo 5 is the biggest offender, requiring readings of books, comics and the viewing of a web series to best understand the characters, of which most of them are with you throughout the entire game, spouting exposition. But that will do for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, maybe you learnt something, and I hope at the very least you found it interesting. If you want a detailed video on Atriox's last known sighting before Halo Infinite, I have done a video on just that. So do please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to stay in the loop with more Halo content, and until next time Spartans, this is Jack, signing off.